friends, it's Christy here for My Favorite Things. I'm so excited to be back with you today. I'm going to be creating a card using the Winter Wonder and Put the Jolly in the Holidays stamp sets. So I've stamped those images out in Extreme Black Hybrid ink on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock. And then I'm going to take a piece of pattern paper from the Cheerful Plaid 6x6, and I'm going to tuck that under my coloring panel because I want to pull my color palette from that pattern paper that I'll be using later on. So I'm going to be using my Copic markers to color in my images today, and I'm going to be using E40, E41, and E42 for my critters. I'm starting with just the lightest two shades for my polar bear, so the E41 is going to be my darkest. I'm going to lay in some shadows wherever I think they should go, on the back of his body, underneath that scarf, and on the undersides of his arms and legs. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E40. I want him to look white, but just have a bit of shading to him so he really pops off the page. So that's why I went with those lighter shades. And then I'm going to grab my 0 marker, the Colorless Blender, and just smooth over the transition from the E40 to the white cardstock. I'm also going to use those two lightest shades for the belly and underside of the chin of the little squirrel, and I'll blend out the edge with the Colorless Blender again. But once I get to my bunny, I'm going to start with that darkest shade, the E42. I wanted him to look like a light brown bunny, so that's why I'm using that darker shade in there. And I'm going to add his shading on the back of his body and also underneath his little sweater there where that would be casting a shadow. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E41. Make sure to color in his little paws, and then I'm going to use the E40 for the highlight, but I'm going to leave a little white area around his eyes and nose. And then for my red squirrel, I'll use E11, E13, and E15. So my youngest son, who's 16 years old, actually picked out the supplies for today's card. I had all these different things kind of laid out on my desk, trying to see what my options were. And he came into my craft room and he said, let me choose what you're going to use. I said, okay. I like to let him do that sometimes. If he wants to choose, why not? I think it's kind of fun. So he picked this stamp set because it had a polar bear and a squirrel in it, which are my two favorite animals. And he also chose one of the pattern papers that I'll be using a little bit later on. So I thought that was really fun that he participated in the creation of this card. I used T1 and T3 to do the polar bear's muzzle and the inside of his ear, and then I did T5 for his nose. And then I'm giving my critters some rosy cheeks with R11 and R20. Just softening that R20 with that R11 so it kind of smooths out into the fur. And then for the Christmas tree, I wanted to pull out that darker bluish green that is in that plaid pattern paper. So I originally grabbed G03, G05, and G09. And I'm going to shade this bottom one on the left-hand side with the highlight on the right. And then for the other tree, I'm going to flip it. So I'll have like a central light source on today's card. And each of these trees is going to go on each side of the focal panel. I felt like that wasn't quite strong enough in contrast for me, so I did bring in the G28 to go over that with a second layer. And then when I work my way back down in the reverse, I'll blend out with the G09. I decided to skip over the G05. I just didn't feel like it was necessary. It is pretty close in tone to the G03. So I'm just going to use the G03 for the highlight, and I didn't take that all the way across. I left one layer of that G03 all by itself. For the birds, I chose R35, R37, and R39 to pull in that nice pinky cranberry red that's in that plaid pattern paper. And for both of them, I put the dark color at the top and then put the lightest shade on the belly and the tips of the wings. And then I'm going to move on to these little critters accessories. I'm going to do every third stripe on the polar bear's scarf with this red combo. And then off screen, I'll also do the little bunny's collar there. So I'm just putting that color, the R39, down at the bottom of each block on that scarf and blending up toward the top with the R37 and then the R35. And then the stripe right next to the red one is going to be white, and I went with T0 and T1 just to add a bit of shading and let that fade into the white. And then my third stripe is going to be a lime green to pull in that lime green that's in that plaid. And I chose YG11, YG13, and YG17. So I'm just going to fill in the rest of those stripes for the polar bear and also for the bunny's collar. And then I'm going to give him a green sweater. So I'm using that YG17 to kind of put a shadow on the underside of his arm and down his back, and also delineate that little hem of his sweater. And then I also put a shadow up under the collar since that was kind of big and bulky. I wanted that to cast a shadow. And then I blended that out with the YG13 and the YG11. And then for the squirrel scarf, I'm just going to use those darkest two shades since there's not a lot of room there. Plus I wanted it to be a little bit of a darker tone. I used R000 and R11 to color in the inside of the bunny's ears. And then I trimmed these images out with their matching dies. For my focal panel, I die cut some Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock with the inside and out stitched circle stacks. And then I also use one of the Stitch Slimline snowdrifts to make a snowdrift. I don't have the shorter version, so I just used the Slimline version for that. And then I'm going to take the little snowflakes that are in the Winter Wonder stamp set, and I'm going to stamp those all over the top of that little circle. I'm going to coat that with some clear embossing powder. It's pretty hard to see the little stamping until you've got that powder on there, so I could see that I was missing a little space at the top. So I'm going to re-stamp those little snowflakes to fill in that space and coat that with some more white embossing powder. And then I'll bring my heat tool to that. I like to heat it up from the back first just to minimize the warping. And then I bring it to the front until everything is all nice and melted. And then I'm going to bring in some Distress Oxide ink. The first shade that I'm using is Salvage Patina. I'm going to bring that in from all the sides except for the bottom because I knew that was going to get covered up by that snowdrift. So I'm going to get that nice and smooth on there. And then I also want to do a little frosty glow at the top of that snowdrift. So I'm adding that on there. And then I want to darken up that sky. So I'm going to bring in some peacock feathers and just carefully add a little bit of that to the outside edges. I don't want it to get too dark, but I definitely want to have that more vibrant color on the edges. And then I blended that back out. And then I'm going to take a little microfiber cloth and just clean off those snowflakes so that any ink on there is removed. For my sentiment, I'm going to use one of the ones from Put the Jolly in the Holidays because I'm still working on my Christmas cards. So I'm doing the I Love Snow Days with You for the front of the card because this one is going to fit perfectly inside the grounding elements. This is the longest of those 3 dies, and I'm going to use that to die cut that out so it's just something a little different than like a flag banner or something like that. Then I'll pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using some snow cone cardstock, and I'm going to stamp some more images and another sentiment from the Put the Jolly in the Holidays stamp set. So I chose the little fox. I thought he was super cute, and also the owl. So the pattern paper that my son wanted me to use is from the Jolly Holiday 6x6. So I'm just going to flip through until I come to the one that he chose, which is this lime green with the little trees. So I'm going to use these two. I'm going to die cut them with the A2 Stitch Rectangle Stacks Set 2. And I also die cut a Stitch Scallop Basic Edges 2 out of some white cardstock. So I'm going to glue the lime green piece over down on the left side of the card. So I'm just making sure to line that up so there's just a very slim border on all the edges, but I want to make sure that it's equal on all three sides there. Then I'll take the little scallop border and I'm going to attach that to the plaid pattern. It was a little bit long, so I'm going to trim off the excess there, and then I'm going to glue this down justified over to the right side of the card, just making sure that I have that same amount of border on all three sides so everything lines up perfectly. Then I'll glue my snowdrift down to my focal panel so that all of those snowflakes are coming down from the top, and I'll add some foam tape to the back of that. I'll peel off those release papers and then I'm going to add that to the card. I want it a little bit more toward the right, but I want a little bit of that plaid pattern paper showing on the right hand side, so I just shifted it a bit to the left, and then I'm adding that sentiment with some foam tape under the parts that will not be supported by that focal panel. And then I can bring in my images. I'm going to start with the two trees because they are going to be in the background and the other images will be overlapping them a bit. So I'm going to put one on either side, like I said. And then I'll take my polar bear. I just love him so much. And I'm going to have him standing down on that sentiment strip so that it is integrated a bit more into the scene. And then I'm going to do the same with the bunny on the right hand side. So he's going to be overlapping the edge of the focal panel just a little bit to stand right above the U in that sentiment. And then I'll do the little red squirrel overlapping the polar bear just a bit. So they're all just looking up at that beautiful snowfall that's coming down. The little standing red bird, I put a tiny piece of foam tape behind so he could overlap the edges of the sentiment strip and the focal panel, and then the flying bird is going to go in the sky. As a finishing touch, I added a few sparkling clear sequins, and I'm going to fill in the holes in the center with some stickles. I'm using Christmas red, lime green, and stardust. So I'm going to do two of the little sequins with each of the red and the green, and then just one with the stardust stickles because I'm going to use that more on the focal panel. I wanted to add a little sparkly frosty edge to each of the trees, so I'm just following the shading that I did and kind of separating each little part of the tree. Then I'll add a very thin line at the bottom edge of the polar bear's scarf, and the same for the squirrel and the collar and tail of the bunny. So I'll pick that up to the camera so you can see all of the detail and how that sparkles, and give you another peek at the inside as well. I hope you guys enjoyed the November edition of Christy Gets Crafty with my favorite things. If you did, be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. We can chat. I love talking with you guys. Subscribe to my favorite things for more inspiring videos just like these here on screen. Bye-bye.